In this clip, we're going to use some basic brushes and sculpting methods to flesh out this Chameleon sculpt that we had fleshed out in our base mesh process when we were using Z-spheres. As with most models, I like to start things off using the move brush, making sure your perspective is enabled if your model is symmetrical, just to get the forms established before you start to fill in things with clay brushes or any other sculpting brushes. So I'm just looking at the profile of that chameleon head, and I'm thinking about the eyes. I'm thinking about this hunchback kind of area here, and I'm just trying to establish that. Just trying to get that arch, just pulling up this geometry around the back, deciding to go big and just continue to stretch. It's odd how you never really notice these things until you decide to do a project like this, how flat of a body they have and how tall of a back arch. Just went ahead and Dynamesh at a slightly lower resolution, which is a great advantage, because sometimes you can have too much resolution to manipulate your model. So you don't want to go too high. There is definitely a downside. Just manipulating the branch here and back to his back. And his underside, probably come down a bit more. Just really paying attention to his overall anatomy and what type of changes I need to make mine look a bit more anatomically correct, yet still stylized. Okay, just use inflate just then. Now I'm just a bit of smooth. Just go ahead and Dynamesh, and I'm just gonna sculpt that curl in the tail there. No need for it to stay a complete separate piece of geometry. Alright, and we've definitely made some progress on his tail and back here. Still a ways to go. Just figuring out how this curve is going to work here using the damn standard brush, or my variant of a damn standard brush. Okay, definitely got to get that curl in. It's a very iconic part of the chameleon, next to his eyes and tongue, of course, but ours won't feature a tongue. Maybe next time. I'm just using that damn standard brush to kind of carve out the base of his eye here, and now I'm starting to notice the profile a bit more, and I just sculpted in a bit of a nose. It's always good to drop in some nostrils. It's good to help you kind of figure out placement. You know, just kind of working from this front 3/4 view here. I also have other images of chameleons off screen, like several images for referencing different angles, texture. I have some close-ups of the tail, all sorts of things. So whenever you need it, you can quickly just look and get that information. I'm just using masking to help kind of reposition these features here. Okay. Need to pull out his whole face a bit and bring it closer to the branch, similar to the reference. I'm assuming this is a standard posture of chameleons. I'm just going to sculpt in a mouth. Okay. Now starting to kind of see it now. Let's go up to the crest here. Kind of play with the shape. Chameleons come in all sorts of varieties in the species. All of them feature all kinds of different crests on top of their heads and horns and all sorts. Alright, just using a clay brush to fill some things in here. Okay. The head is starting to find its way. Just starting to carve in some wrinkles. There's definitely some wrinkles around the eyes. And we'll have to definitely tackle that, so I'm just playing around with it now. Using a damn standard brush. Now to a standard brush, I'm just gonna carve an eye like so. Zoom in a bit. And a little clay brush to flatten out in there. And little by little, he's starting to feel a bit more real. Just nudging some things around here. That move brush. Definitely like to spend some time rotating around, especially from underside angles, all sorts of unusual angles to make sure your forms are working. Just fill in this gap here, because he's definitely no gaps in his neck in the reference. Okay, back with that move brush just to accentuate that hump there, like so. And as you'll see as we move further down the line, it's never too late to make large form changes in your sculpt. There's always some kind of way. Even with textured pieces, you can always make some large edits. Okay, just pushing and pulling a few things here. Just paying attention to the anatomy for some of my reference. Okay. From this angle, I just wanted to tweak the shape of the eyes. And you could choose to just use a pair of spheres in replacement of the sculpted eyes I have here. There's no wrong way. Okay. Just continue to fill in this gap here. Get something that looks a little bit more like the real thing. Okay. And continue to play with that profile, that head. Definitely want to nail the head in some kind of likeness. And I'm just masking the eye, inverting it. I'm just gonna push it forward a bit. so. Just tighten my mask. Just begin to look at things from the front here. Okay. And next we're just going to go ahead and do some sculpting on these arms here. Just using the inflate brush to thicken things up a bit. Alright, I'm just going to move to the branch subtool here and just reposition things a bit. Branch is definitely helping to kind of position his hands here. Okay, back to the move brush and just getting things into position. I'm just stretching these fingers here, using that right around that branch. Might even be helpful to check out some videos of chameleons, how they move, just to help kind of get a broader sense of visuals. Okay, and back to the tail here. And with a larger brush, just make some edits and a bit of smoothing. And he's starting to look like our reference, at least a version of a chameleon here. Just working on that rear portion of that crest. It's a bit more prominent in my other reference images. Now back to the face. I'm just gonna switch to the polish brush just to flatten the underside a bit. So I'm just gonna move it downward using the move brush, holding Alt key, that was. And I'll switch to standard brush just to start a little detail for those spikes. Those tiny spikes underneath his, running underneath his body. Okay. Just using the move brush to kind of test out an approach here. Just a tiny move brush. I'm just pulling these. You might do that. You might try out some other methods. It's just something I like to do. I just try out some ideas for approaching areas. Alright. Now let's see. Our next area to focus on. I'm just going to focus on these arms here. Just masking them off. Like so. Cleaning up my mask. And once we get these masks, it'll be easier to hide these arms so that we can sculpt the rest of the body. Or if you wanted, you could have created these as separate subtools. That also would work just fine. I'm just gonna go ahead and unmask. Now using the mask lasso brush. Very handy for quick masking. And this brush is very dependent on your camera angle. Just make sure you have perspective disabled when using it. Alright. And I'll polygroup those legs. So now we can just isolate and make these kind of edits. Just flattening the underside and bring everything back. And I'm just going to smooth along those joints to fix the stretching. Bit more smoothing. Let's go ahead and center things up in our viewport here. And next, with that move brush, just perform a little nudge here on his mouth. Just trying to get that's almost smug, disinterested look that chameleons have. And with the clay brush, just making a few strokes here and there to support our forms. Okay, and now from this angle here, just using the standard brush to add a bit more definition to the crown here. Like so. And straight down the middle. And along the back as well. Okay. Trying something along his spine here. The move brush. Just kind of inflate this area. It was looking a little flat. So I'm just alt clicking to move that outward. Reshaping the tail. Like so. Just slowly nudging everywhere into a little bit closer to final. Alright, once we get the base form overall shaped up, where we won't be doing too many large form edits, then we can move into our secondary shapes, which is a bit of wrinkles here and there. For now, I'm just using the damn standard along that curve. Just want to try to add a little definition here, underside of his leg. Something I saw in one of my reference images. Just unmasking and making some more move edits here. And a bit of smooth. We might just get rid of that and go for the clay brush to build up the form. And sometimes I'll just use the damn standard brush to carve in a crease just to smooth it out. It's a whole approach to making strokes and immediately smoothing them out. Okay. We're giving that leg a nice amount of tension here. Trying to figure out that. Zoom out. Bit of smoothing. And let's go ahead and move on. And see what forms we want to edit further here. Figured I'll pull the branch down a bit more, just to allow the profile to shine a bit. Okay. Turn perspective back on. And I'm constantly hopping in and out of perspective as some tools, mostly masking brushes, work appropriately with perspective off. So, and occasionally, like now, I'll leave it on. Back to the move brush. There's not a lot of large forms sculpt into the surface here, so I want to make sure we spend a decent amount of time establishing the general body here, because the next largest stage is the texture. As a lizard, he has a fair amount of surface detail. So just going around and smoothing everything, since upping the resolution. Sometimes upping your resolution kind of steeply will retain some of the faceting from your low poly resolution. So you'll need to do a little smoothing. So I'm just coming in with the damn standard brush on my variant of it to just carve in some more creases here, as well as kind of figure out the flow of these. I'm just slowly making strokes, filling in areas, just slowly weaving them in and out of each other, not really connecting, in hopes that it actually looks like wrinkles and folds of skin. Every once in a while, I'll let a stroke connect with another stroke. But also a good time to make sure you have a close-up shot of a chameleon eye. Okay. Back to this detail here. Looking around the eye now. Just gonna take the polish brush. Just gonna flatten around the eye here. I feel like there's a bit of a edge to their eye, so I'm just using that. Okay, just continue to carve in some folds here. Right now I'm just laying these in really loose. I'm realizing that those folds come in pretty far on the eyes here. Now a bit of standard brush to add a bit of form to these folds, just a little bit, not too much. Just adding those right between those creases, just to support those creases there. Okay. And as you see them here, I'll zooming in and out, something you want to do a lot as you work on your model, to make sure these details are working at a moderate distance, as well as up close. Okay. Let's move on here. And I'm just going to work on the underside of the chin or mouth here. And I'm noticing a bit of a pattern in the flow of his texture of his skin. So I'm just making those strokes for that. There's a very subtle flow to the scales. So I'm just trying to get that in now before we eventually add the scales. So these are kind of like the secondary shapes here and there. There's a bit of texture running along this mouth here. I'm just using the clay brush to build up those scales. Giving it a fair amount of pressure, so I won't have to return. Just hitting a couple of these with additional strokes, just for variance mostly. Okay, that's a good start for that. Alright. Now back to the clay brush. I'm just laying in some test strokes for the texture for these scales, and I'm just using the clay brush and just dabbing around, just trying to get a feel for the stroke there. Let's try a scatter and a spray. That's not working. Let's go back to dots. And this might just be the way we create this texture here, as tedious as it might be. Just changing our Z intensity just then will allow us to make more dots faster. And if we need to increase our forms here, we'll just come back with the contrast brush to help us do that. But I think this is working. Just increase my Z intensity a bit more. Okay. I think that is a bit closer to the definition we need. But these things change depending on where your model's going. So it's not a bad idea to perhaps export a version to the engine or wherever your model will be viewed to see if this texture is working the way you need it. But in ZBrush, it's looking great. Just gonna play with this arm a bit. Alright, especially now that we're moving on with the texture, it's a good time to make sure you're happy with everything else. Just using a standard brush to sculpt in a little folding skin in a few areas, such as inner elbow and around his hand. And really notice Chameleon's had loose skin until I grabbed all these reference images. But this could vary by the chameleon or age, perhaps. Okay, let's do a little bit here as well. Just making a few strokes with that standard brush, and occasionally holding Alt to make some strokes right next to it, just to support our folds here. A bit of a clay brush here, add a bit of volume. Okay, let's go ahead and nice inflate brush here, just to kind of correct my volume in the tail. And now coming in with some damn standard. nicely along there. Okay, just accentuate that curl. All right, let's come back to adding some scales with the clay brush. Just like before, just dabbing, making tiny strokes, and moving on. Okay. I'm changing, well, not intentionally changing the stroke, but making these rapid strokes. I am applying various levels of pen pressure, and it'll add to the variety of the height these strokes are coming in at. And like I said before, we'll also come back with the contrast brush to heighten these details a bit. Just continue to fill in these gaps with scales here. This is sped up just a bit to cover the process. As I said, this is a tedious one. Usually there's a way of customizing a brush to kind of expedite this process, but I think I just preferred this look. I felt this a pretty close representation to the scales on Chameleons, so figured to just stick it out. And sometimes art works like that. Sometimes you'll have a project that seemingly has some aspects to it that require you to do things a little differently. It's part of the challenge at times. And now up here in the crest, around the edges, these scales are a bit bigger, a little bit more pronounced. So I'm doing that here. And now I'm just going to come back with smaller size and fill in some scales here, like so. And you can see that symmetry really helping us out. And that's another great thing, especially with an asset like this, using symmetry. It's great because you can't see both sides of this character, so there's no telling that the same textures on the other side from the viewer. Just continuing to add that texture here on the eye folds. A good time to up the resolution if needed. And right now we have just enough to support these details. Just up my Z intensity a bit as I make my brush a bit smaller. Okay, just about filled in these folds up top with tiny little scales. This is definitely a task you want to perhaps zone out with some music, or maybe you can work with a movie on. Okay, just looking around. If we missed any spots, just gonna go ahead and restroke these scales here. Like I said before, we could use the contrast brush, but every now and then it doesn't hurt to restroke an area. Okay, just hitting things with a bit of smooth, and now restroking those scales around the edge of his mouth here. Okay. Like so. Let's go ahead and add some more of those scales underneath the eye. And practically everywhere. Occasionally changing the size of these scales. Even though they look relatively consistent on real chameleons, I'm just playing with the size a bit. Okay, zoom out some. I do want a bit of variety of intensity in these scales. Alright, we've moved along and filled in some area since. And I just want to do a little work on these hands here. And just kind of form them out a bit more. They're not a prominent feature of the piece, but I do want them to kind of wrap around the branch a bit better. So I just use the selection tool to isolate them. And just using the move brush, and now with a bit of transparency with ghost mode enabled, just pulling out the fingers here, making good use of that alt click and drag with the move brush. And I'm just kind of shoving things around to form those webbed fingers. Alright. And their hands definitely have more detail than this, but for ours I'll kind of keep it simple. Even have like little claws and all. Really cool. Just pushing this in. And I think that's enough form to really support what we have going on, at least for now. Okay, just gonna do a little bit of the same here for these. Just using that selection tool to hide everything I don't want visible. Using the selection lasso version. Alright, now back to move brush and just pushing stuff around. Alt click and dragging. And just getting those toes all shaped up a bit. I'll just leave those as nubs for now along the top. Like so. Okay. Now using the FormSoft brush, I have the ability to sculpt normally, as well as sculpt over texture areas without deforming them too much to add some surface details or secondary shapes I am starting to notice now at this stage. Now typically you want to make sure you have these secondary forms and shapes established, such as this area underneath his mouth I'm sculpting now, before you move on to the details or texture. But brushes like FormSoft allow you to come in and do these types of sculpted edits onto your textured mesh, which is pretty awesome. So definitely take advantage of that. Other techniques involve the use of layers, which we'll cover in the future, to separate your surface details or any other edits you might have in mind. I'm just using the standard brush, which forms or works similar to the FormSoft brush, to just get some wrinkle folds around the arm here. Real subtle light. Okay. Just continue to move on from here. Added a few more wrinkle folds here and there. Just going to switch to our regular selection tool to isolate the body. And I'm just going to use the damn standard brush to carve in some light creasing on the underside and kind of drag that pattern outward towards his body as the scales kind of bunched up together on the underside of the belly. They start to form these rolls in his skin. So that's what these lines represent. The kind of flow, the light pattern that you can see in these scales, at least in some of these reference images. So I just want to establish that now. It may very well be hidden when we start to add the scales, but we'll see when we get there. But if not, it'll serve as a secondary read or extra layer of texturing. So I'm just going to drag this all the way down the tail as well. Just using that damn standard with a light pressure. If you need, alter your Z intensity to get the right depth you want. Just taking it nice and slow, running down the length of that curl. Make sure to change your angles and get that in the front as well. Underside. Keep everything nice and consistent. Trying to add a few deeper creases here on the underside where the folds are probably the strongest. A little bit here as well. Okay. Bit around the arms. Just a little extra definition there. I think we're almost done with this kind of wrinkle slash scale flow layout here. Zoom out and see anywhere else we might want to add or flesh out. Just bring back our legs and kind of do the same thing there, as the legs kind of have a tight flow of scales, whereas areas that are looser, like the body, wider areas, the scales are easier to read, they're rounder. Where on tighter, elongated parts like his legs, I started to notice that they started to look like perfect rows of scales. So you start to notice all kinds of things once you have staring at like 8 images of chameleons. That's why it's so important to grab that reference material and maybe even give it a bit of a study before diving in. But either way, as you're working, as I'm working on this, I'm starting to notice things I didn't notice at first. And that's kind of part of the process, but definitely try to give it a gander before diving in. Kind of help you figure out ways to approach as you're learning new features in ZBrush and so forth. Just continuing to use the damn standard brush here to establish that texture. And like I said before, this will serve as maybe just a secondary texture as we line it up with the scales, or just a path for applying our scales. So it's not just a chaotic application of scales everywhere. So even our skin has a flow to the patterns in it at a micro level. Okay, and we got just about enough there. Now let's proceed and start laying in some rows of dots here, some rows of scales, this will help us maintain the alignment of the scales as I see going forward here. And I'm not keeping anything particularly straight, but just sort of straight. Okay, and I think I got a nice layout here so far. I'm gonna do the same for the legs here, just laying in these dots like so. Just gonna up that Z intensity a bit, find a nice angle. I think I'll come up here to his hands and just lay out some more. Sometimes I think it's a good idea to hop around in order to make sure you are using the same scale or size of a brush. So if you kind of lay down some dots in a few different areas around his body, you'll keep in mind the relative scale or size you're using. And just running through this hand here, just click, dab, and doing a tiny little stroke to register a mark. Now you could try to perhaps find a texture to speed this up. Probably try to capture a texture, which we'll do to do these spikes along his back. We'll go through a process of generating and capturing the alpha. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and take the long road here. I feel it's really giving us some good results. Alright. And things are looking really natural. Now to the knee. I noticed that the scales on the knee are kind of in a circular formation. So I'm going to try to emulate that here by not going in any linear direction. Just kind of applying them in a circular fashion. Okay. And it's just so subtle you wouldn't even or barely notice it as of now. But when you get lots of reference images and you're zooming in, you'll likely notice some of these things. So now I'm just kind of laying in some light strokes with the clay brush, because I said I noticed that the scales are so close together that they almost look like wrinkles. So I'm going to try to simulate that a little bit by kind of bunching up these scales really close together to the point they look like almost lines, or you could just run the brush over them to also get that look. Okay, maybe later on we can come back and do the underside Just make sure everything's nice and filled in. All the way down to the elbow here. Let's go ahead and move a bit further. Alright. Now here we are on the underside or stomach of our chameleon here. And I'm still playing with these tight bunched up wrinkles of scales here. And I'm just barely moving the brush around just to make sure I create these lines or wrinkles as they transition out into regular or further paced out or unbunched up layers of scales. So that's one little detail I'm just paying attention to here. And when you have this much area to cover, you look for any type of details to capture, if that's your goal. So let's go ahead and quick save. Always remember to save every so often, even though ZBrush will by default save every 20 minutes, I believe. So back into the grind of filling in the scales along his midsection here. No real rhyme or reason. Some of them I try to make bigger than others, only slightly. And some a little bit smaller, some I double tap. Nothing too special here. One goal is to make sure I don't have too much open area, as in all of the chameleons in my references don't have any like bald spots or anything, so it's important to make sure there's no open area. So that's just gonna make this even more fun. Alright, just move the head here to the tail, and we're laying in some lines here with a clay brush just to get that linear layout that you see in these tightly bunched up areas we were talking about. I'm using the standard clay brush here, but you could use or try using any variant of the clay brush. Just try to get your Z intensity not too strong, and just work your way down this coiled tail here. And I'm just gonna blend that up into the body as well as the scales we already established. Just lightly fading that in. Alright, so now back in it with the clay brush, and much like before, just using our clay brush to spot in our scales, running along these lines we just sculpted in here. And I'm keeping these really tight so that they resemble more like folds with a hint of these scales. So as I'm tapping, I'm keeping the spacing relatively tight, and I feel that's a good approach to what I see here on the tail. And feel free to try out any brushes or methods you think might do the trick, or deviate. Maybe you want to sculpt a more of a fantasy lizard or something else. Definitely take this moment to explore brushes and texturing techniques and alphas and all sorts. So make our way around our second loop here. Definitely pulls on your patience. Tackle something like this. Really zone out and kind of tackle it. But we're almost done here. This will be our last bit of scales on the Chameleon here. And then we'll move into enhancing what we have at that point. And as we move our way up the tail, I'm becoming a bit looser in the spacing as the skin is starting to loosen up as we go up the coil here. And you can really get really crazy with these details inside ZBrush. This is only a moderate level of detail. And then of course you would require you to have additional geometry, but all in due time. Okay, still keeping it relatively linear. Alright, just go ahead and move ahead this last section here. Now we're working on the branch that our Chameleon is sitting on here. It's a thin little branch. I'm using the trim dynamic to kind of carve in some planes, add a bit of interest, and now the move brush to kind of change the dimensions here. And back to that trim dynamic brush to sculpt in some edges and flat planar areas. Get this to look more like a piece of wood, something that's sticking out of a tree. So just working the way all the way around. You can also use the H polish brush, give it a similar look. Alright, and now just use the move brush, kind of create a bit of a indentation here. Just trying to add some interest, a little bit of visual interest to the branch. Won't go into doing any serious detail on it. I want it to steal the show from the Chameleon here. Alright, let's continue to polish this a little bit here, and you can choose whatever you want your creation to sit on. Maybe it's a different kind of a branch, leaf, table, or something. Just doing a little branch here. Just gonna make a little indent in the branch there. Just trying a little clay brush and just to flatten that out. Okay, and I plan on the edges of that being clipped in our final. So just leave it there, like so. Now I'm just taking a clay brush, kind of add another layer of surface texturing and forms. Okay. Switching between the H polish brush and occasionally the clay brush. like so. Just add in some little indents in here. Just want to make sure I don't underdevelop this. And anything I don't like, I'll just polish out or undo. But so far, I think this is working. Just a few more edits with the clay brush. I'm just holding Alt and lightly sculpting along the surface just to create some indents along the way. And making sure I'm kind of spacing out some of these little details. Back onto the body or our chameleon. Just applied a bit of that contrast slider. It's very subtle in its effect, but it is boosting your details. And I'm using the contrast target brush to enhance our details here by hand. And I just decided to use the damn standard brush to come in here and try to do this by hand, just to create some creases. If you find a nice detailed picture of a chameleon, you get to look at the scales. They actually do have a little bit of depth. They're not as flat as ours are overall. So I just want to see how we can go about adding a bit more of that. I also want to change the size or scaling of some of the scales on the head. I know some of the scales are a little bit bigger in certain areas, so it's another thing I want to approach before we conclude our sculpt here. Running that damn standard brush along a lot of these scales here. And the Z intensity is really everything. These subtle carving into these scales here wouldn't work so well at a different Z intensity. And my pen pressure is also important, but it often requires you to get a pretty good Z intensity to work at the scale you need for something like this kind of detail. Started to notice that at some point the contrast brush starts to get really artifacty, or your details start to look too sharp. Similar if you over sharpened a image in Photoshop, things will start to get grainy. So it does have its limits. And you have to rely on just the sculpting brushes. So back to the damn standard brush. Just trying to give some contrast between the depth between these scales. And I'm just gonna apply this sparingly. I want to do the entire body. Just key areas, perhaps head here and there, maybe the hands. Okay. And just continue to work your way around and continue to look at your reference for information for how to approach some of these details. Alright, but we're in the home stretch. I feel like he has enough form and detail to hold him for presentation. Okay. Just continue to outline these little notches around his mouth here, like so, and anywhere really you see fit to kind of enhance. Okay, zoom out a bit, see how it looks. Now zooming back in a bit here, continue to use the standard brush along the crest of the chameleon's head here, like so. And I'm just loosely following our previous strokes to create the scales. All the way around, just giving it a little extra detail. Alright. Moving forward here, onto the clay brush with a light Z intensity. I'm just running across a few of these scales, redrawing them slightly bigger to create a bit of variety and make some of these scales bigger, like so. And just sparingly place these around the rear of his head here. Right, and I like that size. Really adds a bit more to the overall scales here. And you can come back in with some standard brush and accentuate those as well, like so. All the way around. So you can use the clay brush to make larger scales and then come back with the standard brush. Alright, just looking around and see how far we want to take this. Just adding a little subtle detail. I'm looking at one of my references here. Just trying to grab any kind of details I see and try to incorporate them. Okay. Now's a good time in the piece to start considering things such as the angle you want to capture your creation from, as well as perhaps posing or any overall areas you might want to work on or edit before finalizing. As we're pushing up on these final details here, still applying a mild amount of pressure to these scales, just upping their contrast and visibility when you're up close like we are. And this is definitely a more detailed example approach of texturing. Typically most would just find a alpha and just stamp it along. But sometimes you gotta just go with what works. And even with these edits now, I still think clay brush was a good direction here. Okay. Still shaping up some of these larger scale sizes here. Just continue to work that through. Moving forward here, I'm going to create those spikes along the back of our Chameleon. I'm just going to go ahead and append a plane 3D. I'm going to go to the plane with isolate on. I'm just going to go to geometry and subdivide a few times up to subdivision level 6. Let's give us a fair amount of geometry. And now with the move brush, I'm going to alt click and drag, create a spike, and then just kind of taper in a bit to create a small representation of the spike that's going to run along the top spine of our Chameleon here. Just continue to shape it. The better we make it here, less we might need to do any sculpting once applied. Just lower my subdivision level to smooth things out a bit more and back up. Alright, that's done. Let's look at it from the top. I turned off perspective. Go to the brush menu, navigate down to from mesh, and that will capture your alpha from your mesh. Alright, so now let's up the Z intensity, and you can kind of see it here. Let's go into stroke and edit our lazy step a bit, and now we can see that alpha coming through. Let's lower that lazy step. You can see more of it. And there it is at 100%. A few test strokes, and that's looking pretty good. So play with our focal shift. And let's double back. And I'm just going to edit the spike, make it a bit higher so that our results are a bit taller. And we're just going to go ahead and repeat the process. Brush menu, from mesh. Alright, and then create a additional alpha in this brush. Make sure you have the standard brush selected when you press the from mesh button. Just come in your preferences and turn off the tablet pressure sensitivity. And that way you can create a consistent row of spikes independent of your Z intensity. And just play with the lazy stepping to play with your spacing. Okay, so just like that, we created a spike brush and just run across his spine from the top. Now, so going in the wrong direction here, so we're gonna have to stroke in the opposite direction to get them flowing in the right direction. Now to play on with the settings for a bit, just find the right angles, such as the top here, to start our spikes from. And now from the back, holding the shift key to draw straight lines. And I'm making my brush a little bit smaller as I work my way down the coil of the tail here. And next, from this angle. And lastly, we're going to need to use our selection tools. I'm just going to undo this portion here. Almost. Alright. There we go. And once again from here. Now with the smaller brush than before. I'm realizing those weren't too straight. Just redrawing them. Once again, that looks even better. Now the brushes, the spikes are actually getting smaller. Now we're just using those selection tools to hide portions of the tail, so we can finish the last portion here. And you could just draw out the spikes without using shift, but shift makes it easier to keep it straight. And that pretty much concludes our chameleon sculpt. I hope you have fun creating our little lizard here. Continue to work on yours as much or as little as you want. I'll see you in the next lesson.